And it's really amazing. The person that we have here today is really the foremost expert on nutrition in the world. Cornell University professor. Oddly enough, he grew up on a dairy farm. You know, so I mean, his background is dairy. The dairy industry was hiring him. They wanted to get, you know, information, pro-dairy information. But sorry, I mean, you can't mangle the scientific facts. And his research is the most extensive research on diet and health ever conducted, as appears in the China study. And everybody knows about what's happening with forks over knives now. So, I mean, this is the reality. So we are here to help you understand diet and nutrition and why you and your friends and your family, you all have to go vegan. So please welcome T. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Big and Bob.
Yes.
Is this on?
I don't think yours is on because there has to be. Can you use this? Is that all right? Or?
Did you?
Do you have to switch wires around, or? Just hold this mic.
Okay. You want me to use this? Oh, I see. There's two. Okay. Well, thank you, Bob. It's really a pleasure. It's a great pleasure to get such a warm welcome as I just heard. So thank you all for all the things you do and the things you're working for. I know everyone is doing various and sundry things to sort of advance this movement, and it's going to take a lot of people doing a lot of different things to make it go forward. I also want to thank my good friend here who works with me, Will Heptig. I walked into this. I walked into this room here just a minute ago and didn't have the adapter for my computer, so I thought I was going to have to wing it, which I was going to have to do anyhow, but this guy's a genius with computers, that's all I can say. Well, how many of you have read the China study? Oh my gosh, it's quite a few. So I guess I have to talk about something different. Well, as you know, I've been at this a long time. I started out, as Bob said, on the dairy farm milking cows, and I went away eventually to Cornell University in graduate school, and I thought the good old American diet was as good as it gets, especially with all that animal protein we were consuming. My doctoral dissertation was on that. My early teaching was on that. I taught my students. I was taught that way. And so that's the background I came from, and eventually got involved, as you know, in a lot of research over the year, a lot of students and colleagues, and I'm really grateful for all of their help and all the funding, actually, I should say, too, that was provided by the American taxpayer. My research is paid for by the American taxpayer, not by the industry. So in a couple ways, that was NIH in particular, and American Cancer Society to some extent, and that's one of the motivations that I feel rather strongly about, because the information we got, as provocative as it is for so many people, is something that was paid for by the American taxpayer. So I want to go back and tell them what we did with it. Of course, I know some people don't like me to talk that way, but that's the way it is. This field of nutrition, if you will, in a broader context, I like to talk about nutrition, because nutrition as a topic, as an issue, as a medical science, has been ignored since the days of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras, 2,500 years ago, talked about some of these kinds of things. And in the modern day, in the professions, both in biomedical research sciences, as well as in the medical sciences itself, we have tended to ignore the concept of what nutrition can do. And I'm going to advance the argument, and hope this will come about, that nutrition is going to be the premier biomedical science of the future, period. And by that, when I'm talking about nutrition, I'm talking about nutrition that's provided by whole plant-based foods. That's simple. And so it brings me to a comment to make here before I show some things on my slides. the vegetarians, in the very beginning when I first started to come out of the closet, in a way, I guess. I mean, I really have to confess that during early parts of my career, I thought vegetarians were rather strange kinds of people. And, I know that's not true, but, and the word veganism hadn't even been invented in those days. And so, as we got into it, the word vegetarianism and veganism is finally catching hold, whereas maybe 15, 20 years ago, it was not quite this way. And so I think we're getting near the tipping point as far as these words are concerned. However, at the same time, I also want to be a little bit candid about something. I've gotten to a point in my career where I'm really interested in advancing the cause of health, period. And for the population at large. And so I wasn't motivated, as I said, by, being a vegetarian or being a vegan when I started this research. It had nothing to do with it. As a matter of fact, I became a little bit concerned because that label, I'm sure you know the story, as wonderful as these concepts are concerned, that label does cause some difficulties with a larger population. It's one of the reasons why so many people don't decide to go there. It's been made into a slightly pejorative word, over the years. Although, as I say, in recent years, it's catching on as something now rather chic and fancy and nice. And so a lot of people are really catching on to it, thankfully. But the concept of vegetarianism, as you might know, involves vegetarians as a group. About 90%, according to the figures that I'm familiar with, about 90% of the vegetarians are still consuming dairy and eggs. I'm just curious, well, how many of you are vegetarians you consider yourselves vegetarians? Not too many, most of you are vegans, I guess. Well, in any case, vegetarians, about 90% are still using dairy and eggs. And the real effect of nutrition on health is from what I call the nutrient profile of food. Excuse me. If only that was a little bit of whiskey, that would come okay. Calm my throat down. But 90% of vegetarians are still consuming dairy and eggs. And they've taken a step in the right direction, without a doubt, with good motivation, and they enjoy some improvement in health. However, the vegetarian diet, typically from a nutritional point of view, is not that different from the omnivore diet. Because the amount of proteins being consumed by vegetarians, the amount of fat being consumed by vegetarians, the amount of dietary fiber being consumed by vegetarians is not that different. At least for the 90% who are still using dairy and eggs. And so what we have learned in research, and certainly what our research told us, dairy is a problem. Of all the foods that I can think of that we should really be concerned about is the consumption of dairy. So I would ask the question, how is it that 90% of vegetarians are still consuming dairy and eggs? It's partly obviously because we haven't really had the information that we now have, as far as the problems with dairy. Now vegans, let's take a step further, and I'm just sharing with you candidly my views on this. Vegans, for the most part, at least this was true 10, 15 years ago. I don't know what the figures are today. I'm only just kind of guessing. But vegans became vegans, I think, in large measure for ideological reasons. I think you probably would agree with that, rather than for scientific reasons or for health reasons. Vegans took a step in the right direction, again, because they cut out all animal foods. There's no question about that. And so I would say, compliment, yourselves in sort of taking that kind of step, especially avoiding the dairy. But the problem here is this. According to the figures that my colleagues in medicine tell me who work with vegan people or individuals or patients, if you will, unfortunately, and we've looked at the scientific data on this, the average fat intake of a vegan diet for vegans is still pretty high. It's up there where it shouldn't be. It's up there in the 25%, 30% of total calories. It's lower than the average public, but it's not that much lower. And so what it turns out is that vegans are consuming a lot of processed foods. Too high in salt, sugar, and fat. Too high in salt, sugar, and fat. And so yes, we see now some evidence that's quite clear that vegans do enjoy a measure of health over and above what vegetarians do, and certainly over and above what the standard American diet is. But that's why I like to return to the word. I mean, as I say, the words vegan and vegetarian have become kind of chic these days. It's nice. I mean, we got a word there to hang our hat on and talk about. And certainly President Clinton uses the word rather liberally and well. But I want to talk about the word nutrition. Nutrition, really, because nutrition is the stuff that goes on with food to create health as we consume the food. And that kind of nutrition, low in fat, low in protein, no animal protein, and as much as possible, low in refined sugar, refined carbohydrates. If you're consuming that kind of diet, that's what I call whole food plant-based diet. Because that gets around some of these problems. So let me just suggest for your thinking that, you know, vegetarian is step number 1, veganism is step number 2, there's a step number 3. And that's what we need to think about. Or at least I myself, I'd like to think about that. And come back to the words of nutrition, what it can do. Because right now we know, I have seen small studies now being done, small studies of 25 to, in the most recent one, 170 people. If you take a group of people and give them a really good, wholesome, whole food, plant-based diet, this works for almost everyone in these studies, and has been done now about a dozen times, not published, just in the last 2 or 3 years. Almost everyone who goes on that kind of diet from the standard American diet, almost every single person sees remarkable improvements in their health. They lose weight, the cholesterol starts coming down, the LDL cholesterol, if you will, the bad cholesterol, it really comes down rather dramatically. Triglycerides are brought under control to a great extent. And so if they have aches and pains go away. If they have angina, if they have heart problems, the angina actually disappears in a week or 2, usually about a week. If one is a diabetic and having to take the insulin meds and things like this in order to control the rise in the sugar, it turns out even for diabetics, we can cure type 2 diabetes doing this. And my good friend, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, and before him, Dr. Ornish, although he didn't conduct this quite as long as Dr. Esselstyn did, it turns out they can cure advanced heart disease. And using that same approach, we can actually cure, and I'll use that word cure a little bit tentatively, but basically the disease goes away, let's say that. We can cure type 2 diabetes taking the same strategy. It's really quite simple. It's really simple. Just using a good whole food plant-based diet. And also, in the research that we did in the laboratory, we could turn on, and it was what really caught my eye, we could turn on and turn off cancer. We turned it on when the amount of protein generally needed was above the amount that we need. And the protein we were using to do that was the main protein of cow's milk. So all of a sudden, pardon? I got this thing here? Yeah, okay. So all of a sudden, I mean, this is really dramatic, and soy protein and wheat protein didn't, and I'll show you this in a moment. But that was so spectacular that cow's milk was a compound, it was a substance at least, that you could actually call a carcinogen. Probably the most potent carcinogen ever identified. I still say that, and I say it whether I'm talking to a dairy industry crowd or a drug industry crowd or whoever, and it's sort of standing the test of time. So it got me going down that road, and then one thing led to another. Eventually, I learned as we went through this research that this whole question concerning the relationship of food with health was extraordinarily complex, biologically, exceptionally complex. There's countless nutrients involved in this game. There's countless kinds of things going on in the body as this sort of operates in that way. And there's countless kinds of responses we can get, good responses when you consume that way. So let me suggest for you thinking that we kind of think that way. We think about the concept of nutrition. You know, it's something that's been ignored for so long. But nutrition, as I say, comes from whole plant-based foods. And the results we get, you know, we do that you can do some calculations, you can save 80 to 90% or so of the total health care costs. I mean, we're on to a revolution. We're on to a revolution. And my concern these days is that I'm really interested in getting back to the public, for one thing, and telling them, hey, you paid for my research. And so I want to share with people, because I've seen too many people, you have seen too many people, I've seen too many people suffering, needlessly, because they haven't been told. Because they haven't been told. And I spent about 20 years, in fact, on expert panels and national policy development and things like that. And I have been involved, in fact, and seen firsthand the interface between the science on evidence on the one hand and the kind of policy that then gets appropriated and told to the public on the other. And that interface that's going on right there is kind of sad, because the interface is greatly influenced by the food and drug industries. Corporate America has played a major role, and I think you know what I'm talking about. So I really want to go back to the question concerning if we just understood nutrition, if we could just demonstrate this, and show these results, I tell you, the world the number of people who would actually respond to that, in my view, would be really great, especially if we provided a society, in turn, that made it easier for them to live that way. How to shop, how to care for themselves going forward, how to really understand this. And so that's the future that I want to share with you. But in this process, as I said, I come back to this question concerning how complex is this. And I'm speaking in part from the experiences I've had since our book came out, now almost 7 years ago. There are people in our society who, unfortunately, are really angry and will do what they can, to try to stymie this information. And so it is what really encourages me. The more they shout and yell at me, the more stubborn I guess I get. But I think that, so incidentally, I've just finished a second book. It was the book that I wanted to write first. The China study was actually a stepping stone to what I really wanted to write. And I'm hoping it'll be out in January. But I'm trying to go back to the basics again, to really understand what is it that allows us to be so confused about this whole topic of nutrition. I mean, there's some really exciting scientific evidence that I'd like to talk about. This is in my field. There's actually some philosophical evidence. There's historical evidence. There's economic interest involved very clearly. It's all this put together. And so we really do have a great, great future. And I think you, as a group, are now taking a major step in that direction and can be the leaders, if in fact we can discuss it in the context, of nutrition. Now, in doing all this research over the years, one of the things I noticed was that I kept running into observations that were off the chart. It was not the kind of observations that I expected to see. And in fact, my colleagues would call it heresy. I mean, the idea that to say that animal protein is a carcinogen, that is heresy. That's enough to ruin one's career, to say that kind of thing. Or the idea that you can say that nutrition trumps genes, at least in my day. Disease doesn't occur because of genes. That oftentimes in the earlier days was considered heresy. It's not about genes. So just to give you a couple of examples, but in any case, as we went through our research over the years, being as complicated it was, number one, and number two, as I was, at least from my point of view, we kept running into heresies and having lived with, really serious criticism. You did it wrong. You don't know what you're doing, kind of stuff. But nonetheless, these heresies, it all of a sudden occurred to me that these heresies were linked. They were linked. And as you start just tracing the network of, all these different heresies one after another, all of a sudden, these holograms, about, you can look at it, you can focus on them, I think that's the right word. All of a sudden, a picture, an image comes into view. That's really what this was about. At least for me, there was an image came into view. And that image was an image that was substantially different from what we believed. And I'm going to take that forward, talking about this nutrition in that context, that this is the way we can solve our healthcare problems in this country. Not just our healthcare problems, really can go a long way to help solve our environmental problems, big time. The relationship between what we choose to eat and environmental problems are really big. Or, as I say, healthcare cost problems, our personal health, violence in the world, obviously violence against any sentient being, violence against animals, clearly, is immediate kind of gratification. You see, you stop that. But also violence in a political sense, too. And what I'm referring to there is going to other countries, as we have done too often, to poor countries, to basically cut down the forest, to make land available for raising cattle, as we have done, or in the process raising cattle that Bob referred to, and then allowing them to create global warming. It was my friend, actually, at the World Bank, who was the first to report on that. You know, not too long ago, the FAO, which is the United Nations sort of USDA counterpart in a sense, they actually came up with a report about 7 or 8 years ago that 18% of global warming was due to the raising of livestock. And that was almost heretical, because that level of pollution of global warming was actually more than industry and transportation, just by consuming livestock. Now, and then, so that was 18%. Robert Goodland, my friend at the World Bank, was a senior science advisor, or senior advisor to the environment for the president of the World Bank for 23 years, a very substantial man. He went back to the drawing boards. I lectured there myself. Went back to the drawing boards, came up with some new numbers. That wasn't 18%, it's 51, at least 51%. And the exciting idea there was...
we can't see it, so
you can't what?
We couldn't see it because of the lighting, so we're just turning lights on.
Oh, okay. Well, you're probably better off not seeing me anyhow. Should I start over again? No. No, in any case, this is a big lead-in. I'm taking too long to get into this lead-in, but I've become really quite passionate about this whole idea in the future and so forth. He went back to the drawing board with his younger colleague at the International Monetary Fund, Jeff Ong, and came up with some new numbers that it was more than 51%, not 18%. And the exciting thing about that, really exciting thing about that, was that they were taking into consideration methane production. Methane as a molecule is able to capture about 25 times as much energy as a carbon dioxide molecule. And all the previous figures, for the most part, have been relying on the calculations of carbon dioxide. Methane, in large measure, comes from livestock. But here's the really exciting thing about it. The methane, when it goes up into the atmosphere or stratosphere, wherever it goes, creates a global warming phenomenon. It turns out methane, it has a half-life of 8 or 9 years. What that means, the methane's up there now, it will take about 8 or 9.5 years for half of it to disappear. That's pretty fast. Carbon dioxide disappears with a half-life of about 100 years, according to the latest figures I've seen. So we can cut carbon dioxide emissions all day long. Politicians tell us they can't do it more than about 10, 20%. That's going to do nothing in our lifetime, and nothing probably in the next 2 or 3 generations almost. Because the CO2 already up there is there. But methane, if we cut back on methane production, if that's that will dissipate faster. We can solve the global warming phenomenon much more quickly by taking into consideration A, the fact that it's methane, and B, the fact that it comes from animals in large measure. So all of a sudden, this whole idea of eating animals, it has major ramifications, for our personal health, for our healthcare costs, for environmental issues, for the violence that is sustained by we do all kinds of things. Anyhow, the research that I finally decided was worthy, and the results that came together also was greatly supported by my good friends Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Mcdougal, Dr. Shintani, and a few other brave physicians who actually, on their own, I didn't have anything to do with this. It was a nice part of the story. We weren't sort of corrupting each other's views in a sense, or being biased by the views of others. It turned out what they were showing when our work came out was that they took real people, especially like Dr. Esselstyn, and put them on this kind of diet. And the results that we have seen and that you know about were dramatic. So all of a sudden the science is over here. It's really done, from my perspective, is sort of supporting all this, not knowing exactly what the results are going to be. They came forward and showed what the results really are. So we have a message now that is so powerful, so strong, that it is really the obligation, I think, of all of us to really take all of this seriously and share it in a way in which other people can enjoy it. And some people have often asked me, some people here today, you know, what can I tell my friends? I tell my friends who don't believe in this, you know, how can I do this? And I have thought about this. In the book that we did, the China study, there's quite a lot of science in there, I think, as you know. And I wasn't confident that a lot of readers would really read that and end up believing it and changing their dietary habits. So we did say in the book, if you don't, I didn't say that I don't care what I didn't say it that way, but I said if you don't believe what I say, just try it. And I would suggest that if you're talking to people who don't want to believe it, just say, it's fine what you do. It's fine. I don't want to argue with you about that. I just ask you one thing, just try it. Because now we know, and if they do it the right way, not piecemeal, but if they do it the right way, no animal foods, no processed foods, low fat, if they do it, they'll see results. That'll bring them around. That'll bring them around. Then the next step is, can they sustain that behavior change? And, you know, people will think out their own ingenious ways of being able to do that and sort of get together and promote it that way. I want to just sort of run you through some slides here. I've even forgotten exactly what sequence. Oh, I apologize for that, K. You know, that sneaks in there every time I transfer slides from the projector to the... The only thing I'm thankful for is not 3 Ks, not 2. Oh, why did I slip backwards? Can I still get this right? You think so?
I think you just go forward. You should be good.
Okay.
You're on now.
Oh, wait, I'm on the wrong one.
There you go.
Oh, great. Okay, so I gave enough lead, and I think I don't even need to show the slides at this point, but I'm going to kind of whip through these so you can see some of the evidence. So basically, it's, as I say, a bunch of heresies that I eventually called principles that eventually sort of describe what I call a paradigm. It's a sphere of thinking that has invisible boundaries, but we know they're boundaries because once we go beyond them, we're told by our friends it's heresy. That's about what it sizes up to be. And of course, this is the early work that we did when, in this case, we were using experimental animals, and I know that's not quite kosher, obviously, but that's what we all do in research, and that's the way I learned a lot of things early on. But this right here was a study that was done in India at the time, as many of you may recall, that sort of supported an observation I was making in the Philippines with small children. Small children having a propensity to get liver cancer at a very young age, and then sort of getting the impression that these children were coming from families who were consuming the higher levels of protein, animal-based protein. So this paper came along in India and showed that if, in fact, you took 2 groups of animals and they're both exposed to carcinogen and you feed the 20% of total protein, total calories as protein, that's the usual recommended levels, the good levels. You see, they all got, basically, the cancer. The animals fed the lower levels, not enough did not. I don't want to I mean, you know this well enough, and so I don't want to belabor the point. So then we did this kind of study here early on, repeating what the Indian workers had done, because I really found that observation on the part of the Indian workers to be shocking and surprising and not quite believable, although it was consistent with what I thought I was seeing in the children. So we did it ourselves, and we were able to show the same thing. Looking at early cancer formation, feeding rid of the higher levels of protein, 20%, you see how that cancer is growing over the first 12 weeks? And if 5% did not, then we did this study. For those of you who may not have heard this before, this was really dramatic because I was just simply shifting the protein intake up and down. And we got to a point where we could turn on and turn off cancer development. Really remarkable because no one had done that before, and eventually it was featured, or a version of this was featured on the cover of our Cancer Institute journal. But I found this really exciting because it just said we can control this, what otherwise might be considered a fatal disease because everybody assumed it was a genetic basis. Now all of a sudden we can just choose the right kind of food and keep that thing under control. Here's another way of looking at it. If you just look at the first nine weeks, feeding the low-protein diet, that cancer never forms, even though there was a very strong carcinogen that was present. No cancer formed. And it wasn't until later that we, gave the 12% or the 20%, we got that. So here's a lifetime. You can see the major effects here of the 20% really creating a lot of cancer, if you will. Just the protein. That's what was creating the cancer. And in final analysis, 5% did not. But then this also was kind of interesting. The animals fed the 5% protein at the end of their lives, if you will, 2 years. That's the general lifetime of experimental animals. They're all alive and thrifty and sleek hair coats, hopping around the cage, very energetic, and all the rest. And so, in spite of the fact that they'd been exposed to potent carcinogen, that was, I have to say, real heresy. The 20% animals did not survive, just feeding 20% protein. So that level of protein then became really kind of interesting because it led to what I referred to. First I thought it's a heresy. That's what my friends told me. That's a heresy. Don't believe that kind of thing. But then in reality, it becomes a principle. And it's this principle here that holds true for regardless what species, and that would include human species as well. That nutrition, experimental cancer development can be controlled by nutrition. Now, I don't know whether you think that's a heresy or surprising or not surprising, whatever the case may be, but in science, that really was pretty dramatic to say you could do that. Instead of, for example, saying genes are responsible, or instead of saying that specific chemicals in the environment were causing that. So then you ask the question, well, how does all this relate to human experience? And basically, it turns out that if you feed levels up to 10% protein, what we learn is that it doesn't turn on cancer until it gets in excess of 10%. And 10% is the level that sustains health. So protein is a good nutrient. We have to have protein. We can't forget that. We need protein. So the question here is really protein consumed in excess is really that's a really important point. And it turns out this 10% level, when they put the human, let me come back to this in a moment. This is the range of human consumption for all of our fellow citizens. We're consuming between 11 and 22%. And that 10% figure is a trigger. So it means most people are consuming excess of the protein they need. All because for so many decades, we've always worried about where we're getting the protein from. And one of the reasons we've done that is because historically, when protein was first discovered, it was discovered with meat. And so protein and meat became sort of synonymous. So when people say, where do I get my protein from? What they're really saying, I got to have my meat in order to get the protein, basically. And of course, now we know, obviously, we've known it actually a long time. Plants have enough protein. And it turns out what's really interesting is the amount of protein we need, and this had been determined in science for probably since 1943 formally. What's that, about 60, 70 years or so. Using good science, we know that 10% protein is enough. That's enough. We actually need less than that. And it turns out when you eat a whole food plant-based diet, that's the level of protein we get. So it reinforces the idea that you consume a whole plant-based, you get the ideal level of protein. So next time a person asks you, where did I get my protein from? You say, you got all you need. You don't need any more. Because what they're really saying, not realizing, I think, is that they're asking, where do I get my meat from? Or at least the question tends to pose that consideration. So here's another principle that I kind of liked, is that as nutrient intakes beyond optimum ranges create adverse effects. If we don't consume enough of our protein, we have a problem. If we consume too much of our protein, we have a problem. And so all proteins operate there. There's sort of an optimum range within which they really do good things when they're consumed as food. So there's optimum range. And when you start looking at these optimum ranges for all the different nutrients, it keeps coming back to the same result. Those optimum ranges come from the consumption of plant-based foods. So it's just one more reinforcement of what this is about. And then this observation here, that I often think is probably one of the most significant that I ran across, and that is that, in medicine, this is really fundamental to the question, the whole question of Western medicine. We rely in medicine on using a chemical to do things. We call those chemicals drugs, okay? And so those drugs, when they work, and we're trying to figure out whether they work or don't work, whether it's useless, we often work in medicine to know we want to know what the mechanism is, what the biochemical explanation is, the mechanism is, okay? We tend to assume that we're finding a single mechanism for a single kind of chemical. As I say, usually it's drugs. If we find a mechanism, we call that the rate-limiting mechanism or the principal mechanism, something like that. I tended to assume that too, myself. So as the protein increased cancer, we started looking, what's the mechanism? Oddly, every time we looked for a mechanism, and that usually meant one graduate student working for 3 or 4 years just working on one mechanism, every time we got to sort of discover a mechanism, every time we looked for the mechanism, we found one. Now that turned out for me to be very profound, because it turns out that's what we were looking at is really biology, not as we might imagine it to be. It was real biology. Biology involves countless things being consumed, operating by a tsunami of mechanisms, each one. And so protein causes cancer by not just one mechanism, by a whole host of things all going wrong at the same time. So it really forces you to ask yourself, what in the world, is this all about? We don't need to go back and try to defend the proposition we can consume more protein when so many things going wrong at the same time. So we got a principle, operate via multiple, not one mechanism. I'll come back to that in a moment, but that's another sort of idea. And so, of course, as I said, the protein, the real heresy, was when I finally got around to realize that the protein we were using was casein, and coming from the farm and milking cows and producing milk because it's justified in having high protein, all of a sudden to run into this theory. Wow, that stuff turns on cancer. That was, as I say, quite a revolution. And one of the reasons we sort of made that comment was because soy protein, whey protein did not do it. And I said, cancer was really my field for many years, at least a major emphasis. And so I'm familiar with the strategies that are research strategies that are used, the regulations that are used to determine what's carcinogenic, what's not. Incidentally, all that work is done in experimental animals for your information. Those determinations, and I, back in 1978, raised a question about why do we do that, but it didn't go over very well, and they're still doing it that way. And I'm really opposed to it. But in any case, using the rules that are used to determine what's a carcinogen and what's not, I can safely say casein is the most relevant chemical carcinogen ever identified. This is something that really does startle people. It's really quite striking. And I took this evidence that I had and went to the 3 major laboratories in the world, to present it to the scientists, my fellow scientists, and making the same point because I wanted to get their feedback, and I knew that they would give me feedback. There's no question about that. And actually, I came away with being rather pleased. They could not discount this finding. Casein is, in fact, the most relevant chemical carcinogen ever identified. So then there's some other stuff comes along, and casein is milk, let's say. So in more recent years, we see, for example, this relationship between milk consumption and breast cancer for different countries. That's pretty impressive. The higher the milk consumption, the higher the breast cancer rates. Just last night, I was in Aspen, Colorado, and I was invited to attend a sort of policy, very influential policy committee called the National Breast Cancer Coalition. You may have heard of them before. They're the ones that tend to set the standards for what kind of breast cancer research should be done and so forth and so on. And I finally got a phone call from their leader about 3 or 4 weeks ago to, if I could, stopping by to visit with them because they had a small group trying to decide what kind of breast cancer research should be done in the next 10, 20 years, because she admitted that what the breast cancer community had been doing during the last 30 years, I think, something like that, was not working. You know, they focus on mammograms, they focus on HRT, they focus on these kinds of things you may be familiar. It's not working because it was just not facing the problem thing. So what I actually found as I went there, some of them are old friends, as they talked about the future of breast cancer research, none of them ever mentioned the word nutrition. They don't seem to know this, or they ignore it. And so I just mention this not to criticize them, but basically to tell about the paradigm and worldview within which we all live. So breast cancer goes merrily forward. Everybody's saying, oh, we don't know what really causes it. We don't know what to do about it. You know, doing mammograms, see if you can catch it early. It might make some difference later. Not really. If we take hormones, it might stop it. You know, all these kinds of things are little cosmetic kinds of things, when the real cause, in my view, is nutrition. So that's what I urged them, of course, to think about was, let's get serious and start thinking about what nutrition. And this right here is something that I thought was rather important to consider, because milk consumption is related to breast cancer. That's pretty powerful stuff. Uterine cancer also. Different points on that chart, but nonetheless, that's really quite clear relationship. Here's a relationship between non-fat milk, generally having higher concentrations of protein, essentially. Non-fat milk, which you always thought was good, when you take the milk out, the protein goes up. So you look at how that's related to prostate cancer. So we men suffer a problem as well as women. And what's really interesting about this relationship of milk with prostate cancer and breast cancer and uterine cancer, we call it in cancer research, those cancers are cancers of the reproductive tract. And isn't it odd? I mean, I can't defend this really, but I just want to make the observation. Isn't it odd that milk somehow, if it's going to do its dirty work someplace, it's the lactation fluid of the cow, and if somebody's trying to tell us why we should be using it or not using it, it turns out the thing it does, best of all, is to affect the glands, basically the lactation glands or the reproductive glands of humans. So, you know, almost there's something, a little secret here that's being, that we're not taking notice of. Drinking this reproductive fluid, essentially, of an animal that turns around and does this to us, you know, affecting our reproductive tracts. I think that's kind of a neat idea. I think I have to say it's another heresy, because there's no question about that. But this is the kind of, you know, as I was going through my research, after a while I was getting a little bit troublesome. I just didn't know, just seeing one heresy after another and have to defend the proposition. But now it's all coming together. It's nice to, you know. So anyhow, nutrients, the kinds and amounts from animal-based foods are problematic. We worked on a lot more than just protein. We looked on fat and to some extent fiber and carotenoids, different kind of antioxidants and stuff like that, other kinds of cancers, other kinds of diseases, and all of it started to really hold together that nutrients from plant-based foods are advantageous, nutrients from plant-based foods are not. Now that's another principle. It holds true, you know, for whatever one happens to be looking at. And here's a case here where, as I mentioned before, about genes. I just want to see if I can abbreviate this here without getting into the details. This little scheme here shows up at the top, normal cells, all blue. And down, going to the left-hand side, if we're consuming a high-protein diet, it creates more cancer seeds, early cancer cells. You go down to the right-hand side, with low-protein diets, less cancer seeds. We actually measured these kind of things, so I'm speaking from evidence that we really had. And you come all the way down, and if one bunch of people or animals or whatever consume a high-protein diet, they're going to get more cancer. One on the right was a low protein, they get less cancer. But here was the kicker that really was kind of interesting. Even if we start with a lot of cancerous seeds and then feed or consume a low-protein diet, we get less cancer. So even though we start out with a lot of cancer seeds, planting a lot of seeds, we can control it because we can simply consume, you know, the right kind of nutrients. And in contrast, if we start out with just a few seeds few cancer seeds, gives a high-protein diet, gets more cancer. And that was one of the first pieces of evidence, and there was lots of others actually that I ran across that. Nutrition actually is far more important than genes in determining the end result. The same thing is seen in humans. If, for example, you compare fat intake, which is a nutrient, with breast cancer in different countries, you see a really impressive relationship. As fat goes up, breast cancer goes up. But then you look for people who, let's say, move from one region to another, like to the bottom there from Japan up the United States, about 100 of these kind of studies. As they move from a country of low risk to a country of high risk, without changing their genes, they get the cancer of the country to which they move as they change their diet. Again, pretty powerful stuff, and very much supportive of what we actually saw in our own studies. So it turns out this high fat intake really could easily have been only a surrogate for high animal protein intake, because high animal protein intake can account for that. So we got here, health and disease begins with genes but do not end with genes. And then we did this really rather large study in China, Oxford University, Cornell University, and a couple of Chinese academies. We actually had about 24 laboratories around the world actually working on this at the time, and it came from the Chinese actually making an observation in the early 1980s that when they went out to see how much cancer was across the country in all these different counties, it was very concentrated in some counties and not in others. So we went there to do the study on that basis. This is the first study done between the United States and China, and we just went to see, we collected all kinds of stuff, because by this time, I'm focused on protein, animal foods, plant foods, so forth, but I wanted to see what about all the rest of the stuff that might be these two different kinds of foods. And it turned out that this was kind of the capstone in a way. What we had been learning in the laboratory, and also a couple of human studies prior to that, was confirmed essentially in the China study. Because it turned out that in China, if you look at the people who are consuming the most plant foods, almost 100%, their cholesterol level is really low, 127 milligrams per deciliter on average, compared to ours, which is much higher, about 100 points higher. And so we went through that and got another principle out of it. Cancer is a geographically localized disease. It's basically environmentally caused or dietary caused. So it's not genetic, it's dietary, it's nutritional. Oh goodness, I've got too many slides in here and I don't want to bore you with too much of this. But it turns out, this is kind of a neat idea here, that all the diseases on the right, these are all diseases in China that we had records on. We had records on all the diseases on the left as well. It turns out the diseases on the right and the left, they tend to aggregate in the same geographic areas. So in that sense, you could say, oh, they must have a common cause. Well, it turns out, yeah, they seem to have a common cause, because the ones on the right, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, the common cause was elevated levels of cholesterol. And elevated levels of cholesterol from very low levels up came from the consumption of animal-based foods. As soon as we start putting in some animal-based foods in our diet, we can expect to see, theoretically, to start seeing increases in these kind of diseases. So, another principle, diseases cluster into rich and poor man's disease groups, each possibly having shared causes. I wish I had more time to spend on that, but basically it broadens our horizon, in terms of what to eat and what not to eat. And the main thing is about plant-based food. So, now I'm going to turn quickly to my friends who, by this time, the China study for me is saying, wow, this is really important. This is it. We can't reverse this whole trend. The data are there, and that's when I ran across Dr. Esselstyn, who actually, when our study was published, actually as a cover story in the New York Times in the early 1990s, Dr. Esselstyn saw it, picked up the phone, called me, wanted me to come and speak at his conference he was holding, and that's when he told me what he's doing. Here's what he did, as probably many of you already know, and that is that he was working with heart disease patients, advanced heart disease. He started with 18 patients, seriously ill patients, and then put them on a plant-based diet. In the beginning, he had them on a little bit of low-dose statin, but later learned the diet was enough. That's what was sort of required in a traditional medical environment. So he had a little bit of low-dose statin. Those 18 patients had 49 coronary events during the 8 years prior to the study. They were really sick. 5 of them had been told, of those of you who have seen the Forks of an Eye film, they were told by their physicians that time was up. There's nothing more they could do for them. So those 18 patients had been really sick with heart disease, really sick and not expected to live. So we put them on a plant-based diet. In the beginning, he did start them on a little dairy until he called me up and we agreed they shouldn't do that. But in any case, he's got them off of dairy shortly after it started. They went from 49 coronary events to 0 over the next 12 years. That's the formal publication of the data, the 12-year figure. That's dramatic. You know, if a drug company could do 1/10 of that, it'd make headlines. It didn't. Now it's not just 12 years. I'm just giving you the formal data that was published. Now he's kept these patients around for 26 years. This is amazing. 5 of those individuals, middle to older age when they started, have passed away, but not from coronary artery disease. And so they went from 49 to nothing over the next 20 years. If that isn't really, really, really exciting, I don't know what is. And of course, you know, that's why his work and the work we did sort of just come together really beautifully and really help to explain, you know, the entirety of the evidence. Here's Dr. Mcdougal. Many of you know who he is, just up the road a ways. And Dr. Bernard. Dr. Mcdougal, I have to say, he's a good friend of mine too. He's had a remarkable career. Now I think it's about 40 years. Been working with people. He also got onto this early in his career with a lot of courage, stepping outside of the medical system, or raising these kind of questions, doing some things. And he got these remarkable results and has, for many, many years, treated people with dietary means. And one of his favorites is treating people for diabetes. And he actually, some of you may in fact have been in his clinic, maybe attended his sessions, but basically he is so confident of what the diet can do for a diabetic. When he brings them in, so the story goes, he tells me, I think he generally he just gets all their medications. He says, give me your medications, and locks them up and won't let them have the medication because the dietary effect is so strong. It is so strong on this, reversing this disease that were they to stay on their medication to keep the blood cholesterol levels, the blood sugar levels down, the dietary effect is so strong they could go into hypoglycemic shock. That's how powerful is this effect. And so I have to give Dr. Mcdougal a lot of credit. About the same time that Dr. Esselstyn called me, Dr. Mcdougal did too, and he wanted me to build his radio program, and so that's how that kind of thing started. So the 2 of us, or the 3 of us, have been really close friends, and he's been doing that not just with diabetics, he's been doing it with other kinds of health problems as well. Dr. Neil Barnard, president of the Physician Committee for Responsible Medicine, he did a formal study on this, compared this whole food plant-based diet with the American Diabetic Association diet, and won. In other words, the whole food plant-based diet was better than the American Diabetic Association diet. And also, same thing. He'll tell the same story. You have to really monitor these people closely, because if they would get on this diet, staying on their meds, they could go into hypoglycemic shock if they don't monitor them really well. So now there's others involved too. I'd like to mention Dr. Terry Shintani in Hawaii, who's been doing this and following up Dr. Mcdougal, who started in Hawaii, and a number of other people. I'm just finding more of my lectures these days, the majority of my lectures these days are in medical schools and medical conferences. And this has just had, this has been turnaround. It's only happened in the last 2 or 3 years. It's really exciting. It's really exciting because there are people in the medical community are now beginning to recognize that there's something to this story, you know, going to a plant-based diet. So we get another principle here. Advanced chronic degenerative disease, at least some, most of them I really think, can be reversed. Now that's an exciting idea. You know, we always talk before about, you know, eat your vegetables. It might prevent heart disease, might prevent cancer, and so forth and so on. Always prevention, prevention, prevention. Most people don't care about preventing anything, you know, 30, 40 years down the road. I sort of say, let it happen. You know, they'll have a cure for that when it comes. I mean, that's the sort of the mindset that people have. Now, here's the new twist to this, in my view. Now you can take people with disease, otherwise going into the doctor to get a drug, and you can treat them with this disease. So nutrition becomes a means of treatment. not just a means of prevention. That really begins to question, in fact, our whole practice of the way we actually do things. So here's a bunch of other diseases too, as my son Tom and I, by the way, my son, our youngest son, was an actor, theater, very good writer, so forth and so on. He was in Chicago, and I was looking for someone to come back and help me write things because he could do better than I could, maybe at least take the... He didn't have any biology, no medicine, he was an actor. So, but he's a good writer, so he worked with me. He got so caught up in this when he was writing with me, he dropped his acting career, decided to go back to medical school. So he went back to medical school. He's now graduated. He's in his second year of residency. He's going to be in family practice, and he's going to make his career work in this area. So... he and I have actually had the good fortune of lecturing together on the last 3 or 4 times. It's kind of fun. So when we got together doing this study, I did at least got back into the literature asking myself, has any of this stuff been around? We're just ignoring it. I mean, I sort of thought there was. I sort of knew there was. Some of this had been reported in the past. But we were able to glean the literature and find amazing results. It never got interpreted either the right way, or if they were interpreted more or less the right way, people didn't pay attention. And so all these diseases here can be controlled by the same thing, plant-based nutrition. That's a big story. And so that title at the top, it says, same whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and or cures all. And this is from the peer-reviewed literature. This is from the scientific literature. Some of these diseases are nuisance kind of diseases, ailments. A lot of them are really serious diseases, but it turns out, and I mentioned to you early on, if you take a group of people, you put them on this kind of diet, they might have some of these kind of conditions. They all seem to respond in the same way. It's a massive means of actually being able to treat people, for the illnesses. It also promotes superior physical fitness. Some of you may know I worked with some world-class athletes, actually, and Robert Cheeke, is there? Robert, are you here someplace? Oh, there he is. I mean, there's a world-class athlete. He's in the film. Unfortunately, now is Brendan Brazier, is he around?
He just left.
Oh, Brendan Brazier, another one, a world-class triathlete in Canada, holds records and so forth. Robert and Brendan and a number of Tony Gonzalez and who I know quite well in the National Football League, and you could probably name some more. I mean, the athletes are going to catch on. And I just got a phone call the other day. Do you know that Tony Gonzalez story? Tony Gonzalez is a National Football League player, and he called me up about 4 years ago. Pardon?
He went to UC Berkeley. Tony Gonzalez.
Oh, yes, he went to UC Berkeley. No, he went to USC.
No, UC Berkeley.
Berkeley? I thought he told me USC.
Now Berkeley.
Okay, I'll have to go back and ask him. How did I miss that? But we can stay in touch with each other. In any case, he's a great athlete, as you know, and he was in the National Football League, and in his 11th year, he was on a plane just prior to the beginning of the 11th season, kind of over the hill for these kind of guys, tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he was on a plane, and the guy next to him wasn't eating the beef or the steak or whatever, the lobster, I'm not sure what it was, and Tony asked him, he says, why do you keep giving that back? And so this guy turned to him, he says, he pulled up, he says, read this. It was a China study. So Tony got the book, starting the season. He's looking for ways to improve himself in that point of his career, and decided to do it. And he lost some weight. He felt great. He recovered, not the same pain, stuff like that. And he picked up the phone and called me. He says, is this really true? You want to know, whether this was for real or not. He was a little concerned about losing weight at the time, which is sort of typical, but he felt so much better, faster recovery time, not so much pain when he came off the field and stuff like that. So Tony went into that season pretty much doing that, not 100%, but getting much closer than he ever had been before. That year, he was still #1 in all the National Football League as a receiver in most touchdowns, most yards gains, and most catches. He also that year broke the all-time record in the National Football League history, for those same records. Then he went in the 12th year. He kept doing it. He breaks his own record every time he catches the pass. Then he went in the 13th year. He got traded with the Atlanta Falcons. He's still playing this year. In fact, the second game that they had, I think it's his 14th year now. He's way over the hill. But he was on CNN in that second Atlanta game, was a leading receiver. Made a couple of spectacular catches when they were beating the Philadelphia Eagles. So Tony is really into this. And Tony actually just called me the other day because he wanted to get, I shouldn't be maybe telling these stories, he doesn't care. He called him because he wanted to know where he could get the 4 Silver Knives DVD. Because he wants to get a lot of DVDs and he wants to share it with all of his friends and, and football and stuff like that. So Tony's a great, he's a great role model, especially for children, I have to tell you. So anyhow, that's one of the stories. There's many others that come forth too, and I'm sure that Robert can tell you about, and Brendan. So I finally end up with all these crazy heresies, and come to realize, and so I'm supposed to be a scientist. I'm supposed to be objective, and listen to things and not going overboard. But my objectivity. I mean, I am so confident of this right now. I'm really feeling it personally. I just happen to believe that a whole food, plant-based diet is the best thing we got going on the planet as far as health is concerned. And the number of things that we can do, if we were to do it, is really, truly amazing. It's just a question of now communication and getting people out to do that kind of thing. I have a new definition for nutrition. That is, it involves the integrative effects of countless food constituents, 100, 200,000. We don't have 30 or 40 nutrients to think about. That's silly. There's a lot more. We got so many chemicals, we could call them nutrients if we want to, if they do good things. And so we got all this stuff working together when we consume food. It really is pretty dramatic. And it involves, amazingly, when we let our body do its work, it does it in a highly integrated way. And I call it body wisdom, if you will. It knows what it's doing if we give the right resources to it. That's what we get out the other end. And so it involves infinite complex mechanism. That was the slide I showed you, looking at different mechanisms, not one thing. That's a very reductionist idea, very focused, misleading. And we've got all kinds of mechanisms for all these kind of things, all working together to produce, as you can see there, comprehensive health. That means a whole bunch of different diseases, all operating at the same time. This goes far beyond what we tend to think about when we think about medicine and causes and effects. So nutrition, one is supported by exercise and rest and water and sunshine, of course. Those are all good things, obviously, especially exercise, I think. But that's all part of it. It's greater than some of its parts, like a biological symphony. Nutrition is not about one nutrient at a time doing whatever we claim it does. It's about everything working together. And that's why nutrient supplements don't work, by the way. We now have records. Nutrient supplements not where it's at, because these are individual substances consumed out of context, and oftentimes they actually do more harm than good. So when you eat whole food, as what nature provided for us for all these years, you get these good results. So here's another strategy. Same dietary strategy controls a broad spectrum of diseases. And finally, I'd like to say nutrition is a holistic activity, not a reductionist activity, and certainly one size does fit all. And the word holistic, if you look in the dictionary, it's spelled H-O-L-I-S, of course, and so I changed the spelling of that because I want to put a W in front of it, because when people just use only the word H, the holistic, it does invoke thoughts about, let's say, holy or holy things, religious things that raise the level of consideration that not everybody want to embrace, because they have different views of exactly what that means. And I'm really convinced that historically the word holy, very likely, if you go back in the old literature, really came from the word whole. It's a wholesome thing. It's really a wholesome thing. And if you start thinking about it in the theological context, that, quite frankly, is almost at the origin of what, in fact, spiritualism and religion is all about. So I want to put the W back in there first time in probably in a few million years, I don't know. And we finally come to the book, and of course there's what we're doing. And the next one I can't show you is Bill Clinton. I think, how many of you saw Bill Clinton's thing on CNN? A lot of people saw that. That was a really generous thing for him to do, bold thing for him to do, because twice in that thing, when he attributed to his, to our book and also Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, he actually said it twice. He said it so clearly. And if you go back, if you have a chance to go back and look at that, watch Wolf Blitzer's face. Because twice he said, no dairy. Can you imagine a politician saying that? I mean, that is the most striking thing he said. No dairy. And I thought, wow. He got the book initially because a friend of his and mine, former governor of North Carolina, four-time governor of North Carolina, Jim Hunt, had actually asked me about 4 or 5 years ago if I could autograph a couple copies because he wanted to take it to Clinton, so he did. So Clinton wrote back to me, thanking me and graciously and all that sort of stuff, but I didn't get the impression he was really using it. And it wasn't until last year when his daughter was going to have the wedding, and she's a vegan, I think. But in any case, she told him, get yourself well, because he still had a heart disease. And so he decided to take it seriously, I guess. And he lost 24 pounds, cholesterol came down, and so forth and so on. And of course, he also attributed this to, obviously, Dr. Esselstyn, who is a heart surgeon. And Dr. Esselstyn's connection with this story came about in large measure because he's a cardiologist and started talking to Dr. And fortunately, here was the last 3 or 4 weeks, we saw about 4 or 5 reproductions of Sanjay Gupta's program. The last heart attack was all focused on Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish for the most part. There's the film, in case you haven't seen. How many have seen the film? A lot of them. There's another 3 or 4 films coming out almost of the same caliber. One is in England called Plan Eat, Planeat. It's a play on the word for planet. It was done by the UK group. Also, it's how many have you seen Plan Eat? Anybody? Not many. Well, they have focused again on Dr. Esselstyn and my work, and that was actually shown in the British Parliament. Really interesting. And in fact, Forks Over Knives is going to be shown on October 24th on Capitol Hill in Washington, bringing in the senators and congressmen. And Dr. Esselstyn and I are going to be there to do a Q&A after the film is over. So it's going to be fun to see what might happen. Oh, this came as a surprise. I didn't know this, but somebody I've since gotten to know him, but this actually appeared on the big screen in Times Square not very long ago. It says on there, you can't read it, it says, congratulations to the China study for being in the top 100 of all books for, I think it was 380 days. This book keeps on going up. It's getting right near the top now. And I don't know when it's going to be stopping. It's over 400 now that it's been in the top 100 of all books. And so it's kind of exciting. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to an online course in plant-based nutrition we had. Will Heptic is here, Elise and Jack Murphy are all here. They tend to go where we go together sometimes. And it's done in conjunction with the company owned by Cornell University that does online courses. So it's a linkage between Cornell and our private foundation. And we're offering this course. It turned out to be very exciting. We're going to be upgrading it here soon. We're anxious to do that. And have some more courses to offer too. We were finally granted the opportunity of offering 19 Class 1 CME credits. So all of a sudden the doctors are coming in and starting to fill up the enrollments. So it's exciting. So there's the end of my story. I should say this is the beginning of all of our story. Thank you. Thank you.
Just have a quick picture. He's going to have a quick picture. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We have 10 minutes for question and answer.
Okay, so thank you so much for all the good work you're doing and your enthusiasm. We're in this together, actually. Something cut me off. No, yeah. I said what I said. I'm sorry. Thank you for all your good work. I said we're all in this together, so we'll keep on working together to do something worthwhile. Question. Wait, yeah.
So in regards to the slide that showed that soy and wheat proteins did not turn on cancer even at 20%. Yesterday we heard a lecture from Dr. Tel Oren who was talking about plant proteins from nuts and seeds and that they were globular proteins, and it was almost like suspect that maybe that they might cause some of the same problems that animal-based proteins had. And do you know of any research that's been done with 20% protein from nuts and seed source other than soy and wheat?
Yeah, I didn't hear that. I didn't know it. It's the first time I'm hearing what you're telling me. And that is the question had to do with whether or not the protein of nuts was apparently told here at the conference might have some characteristics, I think you mean. Globular protein characteristics that might be equivalent to casein, might do some of the same things. We all do reductionist research. I'm going to say that is very reductionist research. And we can always find, observations, to almost show different things. And the problem with doing reductionist research, it might produce things that look good on the surface, but it can be very misleading because of short-term effects. What we're interested in is long-term effects. We've got so many examples of that in the literature. So my question would be, what's the relationship long-term? It's oftentimes a different story. It's just not worked out. Yes?
To get the nutrition, what do you think about raw versus cooked?
Okay, to get the nutrition, what do you think about raw versus cooked? I'm in favor of the food being as near, the more raw, the better. Let's say it that way. We don't have the evidence that I know of to compare in the long term raw food people with people who actually have some cooked food. It turns out raw food, people who are interested in that, it is all plant food to my knowledge, just about. But in any case, so they see a good effect. I'm going to suggest that good effect is primarily coming from the fact that they're consuming plants, not necessarily because they're consuming raw food. The big effect is really coming from plants. Now, it turns out that if you ask Dr. Mcdougal, and they've had more experience than myself and others clinicians, that raw food people who continue this really rigorously, 100%, going forward, they do run into some problems. And it has to do as much as anything else with the fact that they're relying on energy, especially if it's all plants, concentrated sources of energy, especially come from nuts and avocados and things like that. So they actually end up consuming, pretty high fat diets, relying on that because they can't cook the grains very well and get the carbohydrate out of there that otherwise would provide the energy. So but we don't have the evidence to compare the two. I'm very much in favor of consuming salads and fruits and all the raw foods. There's no question about that. But whether to be 100%, I'm not quite there because I just don't see the result. Yes, sir.
What about the fluoride in the water
What about fluoride in water? That's kind of an old story, and I don't know what the latest is on that. But there has been some evidence to show that fluoride, put in water, actually does reduce deleterious. There's no question about that. In some communities, that's been done many, many years ago. But there's other questions being raised by fluoride, possible downsides. But I just can't give you a very definitive answer on what that is at present. I kind of like things according to nature, but unfortunately our nature has been so corrupted, water and air and everything else. And
what do you drink at home?
I drink water. Yeah, we use filters. Yeah, I don't know how much it takes out. I just rely on the companies telling me it's filtered. Yeah, right in the back there.
I was wondering if you could talk about some of the criticisms or if anything received from the High study and also how you respond.
Talk about some of the what?
The criticisms we received of
Oh, talk about some of the criticism of the Esselstyn China study. Yes, in my response, yes. Yeah, there's a couple of individuals who have looked at the China study, and we have this massive amount of data there. Raw data, if you will. Correlations, if you will. 100,000 correlations. And I have written in the China project, they want to ignore this. They don't care about what I say, obviously. But I wrote in there that you cannot infer causality from causation. And so they're reminding me, you can't infer causality from causation. Well, why don't you go back and read what I wrote? Because that's what we don't do. But what you can do, and it's a good statement. That's a very valid statement, so they get some adherents sort of believe in that. You can't infer causation from correlation. But the reason that's a valid criticism is because in the past, when we did these kind of studies, people were looking for single causes of single events, right? And so therefore, it's a good statement. No question about it. But that's not what we did. They're trying to infer that's what it did. That's totally untrue. What we did is to take the China study, look at it more broadly, and form a different hypothesis. Namely, does plant-based foods, for example, relate to lower disease risk? In a broad sense. You have to look at it that way. When you do it that way, and then you actually look at a bunch of correlations, all collectively, if they're all pointing in the same direction, the vast majority are, you can actually say, well, there's a 95% probability this is true, or 99 or something like that. I think it's even higher. So it's a very different approach. They seem not to understand that. These are young people who don't understand epidemiology. I just have to be very blunt. They really don't. They pretend they do, but they don't. And so, anyhow, so then I say, I write that as a criticism. They come back and say, oh, whatever they say. I don't, they call me names, but in the process. But then they go back and look at the experimental animal data. There they're getting really over their heads. Because you talk about our protein stuff, they invent stuff. And it'd take too long here to try to do that. But, in the final analysis, all I say, try it. Decide for yourself. So I've decided not to engage in that kind of conversation anymore. It's not worth it. Yeah. Okay, one more question. I have. Pardon? Oh my goodness! They said tell by the book. This book that I've just written, just finished. It's the book I wanted to write first. It's a book that I wanted to. I wasn't even. I thought I knew. I thought I was comfortable saying what I was saying, of course, and I wanted to be able to write it in a fashion that other people could read and understand what I'm talking about. But I realized that when Tom and I started doing the book, that I also had another criterion, and that was to make sure it's scientifically valid. So I wanted to have a lot of references in the book, unlike a lot of the other stuff that's published. So when we started doing that, all of a sudden the book became big, just sort of recording, that kind of observations we had and the observations of others, and so we had to stop. So the China study, therefore, became an articulation of a view I had, I guess, but mostly based on good science. That was the idea. I never got a chance to go back and actually explain the more philosophical, scientific and historical basis for some of these ideas, because that's where it really gets exciting, gets convincing. So that's what I've done here in this book here. I've gone back to some extent to 2,500 years ago, talked about how, we got on, and the question I'm raising is, how did we go for so long and ignore this? When Leonardo da Vinci, for example, a very brave fellow, did this, or when many others did, Pythagoras and Socrates and so forth and so on. So the book is about sort of delving in the more philosophical construct and the scientific construct. And one of the chief issues there is that in modern day, we have come to sort of believe, as a society, things we shouldn't believe. It really has to do with the intervention of the corporate America in what we're doing. And a lot of it is very subtle, but very, very powerful. I've seen it firsthand, so I sort of cite as much as I can my own personal experiences of this kind of thing. So I end up with a tentative title. I hesitate to say this because I might not use it. But I'm thinking of a book, just one cover, all one color, like red or something, or some kind of color, maybe, I don't know what. And then just have one word across the top, block letters. Can anybody guess what the word might be? No, the word is, you can imagine if you walk in a bookstore and you might say, the word is control. And I know that's a harsh word, for some people, and that's why I'm not really sure about it. And I'm not talking about control in the form of conspiracies. I don't like to go down that road because I find a lot of good people making bad decisions, not because they're bad people, they're making making poor decisions. It really raises the question concerning the paradigm and worldview within which we live. That's what I'm talking about. And so we're all subject to control. And we control others, and our language ends up being an instrument of control. And so I go on to describe, what happens in the 100 trillion cells that are in our bodies, each one a universe unto itself. It's absolutely amazing when you start seeing the structure of a cell. Because if you look up here inside of the cell, you look at all the distributions of space and time and stuff that's in each cell, you're actually looking about seeing the same sort of cosmology you look at when you look at the universe. We got 100 trillion universes in our body. And so it goes far beyond our simplistic way of just looking at individual nutrients and stuff like that. When you get to that level and then go back and look at the data, you say, wow, this is overwhelming. So I'm trying to write a book and just finish it that hopefully will stand the test of time. Thank you very much. I should end. Hello. Yeah, thank you.
I want you to wait just a minute. Here. I want to let you know, if you don't mind, I would like to just talk to the audience. I'm Dixie May. I'm president of the San Francisco Vegetarian Society, for those of you who don't know, and we are the ones that sponsored this event. So we deserve some applause, too.
Oh, yes, of course.
We have some wonderful volunteers that helped us this day. But what I would like to mention to you is Dr. Campbell, I'm so appreciative. He flew in today just to do this talk.
Thank you.
We were planning for him to be both days when we were way back planning, but he's becoming more and more popular, which I'm so grateful. And then he was invited to, was it the Breast Institute, Cancer Breast? What was it?
National Breast Cancer Coalition in Colorado.
And it was the same weekend as we are. And so we were in a foundry, and I thought, well, that's more important because they are more like the establishment. I mean, we all love him and know him and want him, but maybe be unselfish. But he said, no, I'm going to try and make it, and he did fly in just for us. So I'm really grateful to you for doing that.
Thank you. Okay. Well, he's sitting there. The guy that's taking him, he's sitting there in the audience.
Dr. Campbell, what about people who say they have type O blood and they can't give it up?
A lot of volunteers, but we also could use your money for vote donations or membership. So please remember us, okay? I have one more thing. Next year, we are going to be putting on our World Veg Festival the second weekend, so we won't be conflicting with the Blues Festival. However, we are also going to be with the International Vegetarian Congress. So we're going to be having visitors from all over the world. So it's going to be phantasmagoric.